about Islam.
Well, joining us now live from Boston is Robert Spencer. He's the author of Religion and Peace, Why Christianity Is and Islam Isn't. Well, welcome to the 700 Club.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
I've had an interesting conversation with some Arab ambassadors a couple of weeks ago, and one of them actually said that Islam is in need of a reformation. Is that sort of a prevailing view amongst, I guess, moderate Muslims?
It's a common view, but I'll tell you one thing about that, Gordon. It's very important to understand. In Christianity, the Reformation was an attempt to get back to the basics, right? To clear away things that had crept in over the centuries that were not authentic, and to restore the purity of the original message of the New Testament. Now, in Islam, there's already been a Reformation like that. Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, the founder of the Wahhabi movement, was an 18th century reformer in Arabia, and that's exactly what he proposed to do. He cleared away everything that was a later addition in Islam and got back to just what the Koran said and what Muhammad taught. And it became the most violent and virulent form of Islam that the world has yet seen. So I'm not really sure that a reformation is what is needed. What might be needed is a rejection of a literal understanding of a lot of passages of the Koran.
Well, give us some examples of how is the Quran more violent than the Bible?
Well, you know, of course, we all know that in the Old Testament there are passages where God tells Joshua to clear out whole cities and things like that, but the one thing that he never does is say, and all believers should go and do likewise, or that this is your instructions, this is your pattern to follow. There have been many ways that interpreters have understood those passages, most of the time in a spiritualized way, that they in some way stand for the struggle against sin within the soul of every believer. But in the Quran, it's unmistakable that there are passages like in chapter 9, verse 5, slay the unbelievers wherever you find them. Chapter 9, verse 29, which extends and specifies the fight to refer even to Jews and Christians until they submit as inferiors under the rule of Islamic law. These things are not spiritualized, and they are directed as open-ended, universalized commands to all believers to fight against unbelievers. And that's how they've been understood by mainstream Islamic commentators through the centuries. So it's really, it's ridiculous when people say, well, the Bible is just as violent as the Quran. It just indicates that they don't really know what either one of them says.
Is it possible for Christianity and Islam to peacefully coexist, or are they mutually exclusive?
Well, in terms of doctrine, they're mutually exclusive because, of course, in 1 John it says, if you do not have the Son, you do not have the Father, whereas in the Quran it says anybody who says that Jesus is the Son of God is an unbeliever. And so excuse me, those two things don't coexist. But of course, Christians are prepared to coexist peacefully with anyone. But Islamic traditional doctrine, traditional Islamic law, does not allow for peaceful coexistence between believers and unbelievers as equals in a society on an indefinite basis. Muhammad said Islam must dominate and not be dominated. And ultimately, unfortunately, all too many Muslims consider that to be an imperative to push to impose Islamic law upon the societies where they live. And that means second-class status for non-Muslims.
We don't seem to be able to get this. You know, back in World War II, Winston Churchill called that struggle a struggle for Christendom, and he was very bold in saying that. But we don't seem to get this. We seem to want to distance ourselves, if you will, from the basis of Western civilization. We don't want to claim that all our concepts are based on Christianity. Why are we so reluctant to get into this and say our ideas are better?
Well, you know, it's a strange thing, but it seems as if a kind of self-hatred has gripped Western civilization. We're ashamed of ourselves. We're ashamed of our Judeo-Christian heritage. Even people who aren't Jews and Christians are unwilling to acknowledge that the Judeo-Christian tradition has been responsible for the greatest civilization the world has ever known. This self-hatred, I think, has become part of the pop culture ever since the Vietnam War. And that now it's really coming down to a challenge for us, because the Islamic law that the jihadists want to impose upon the world would deny basic things that we take for granted: freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, the equality of dignity of all people before God, the equality of rights of men with women, the equality of rights of all people regardless of creed, so that there's not a special class of people as there is in Islamic law. These things are all Judeo-Christian principles. And so this is the time when we need to cast that off and stand up and defend those things, or we're certainly going to lose them.